Hi everyone. So sourdough is a learning curve, and that's both the beauty and the curse of it. And there's a lot of general advice about sourdough, especially for beginner bakers. But there also are some things I've just learned over the years with practice that just clicked for me, and I don't really see them shared anywhere, at least not often. So the purpose of that video is to tell you about the mistakes I did and the things I do differently now, and hopefully we can fast track your sourdough journey and make sure you are baking good bread in no time. I have my list right here to help me remember everything, so let's just get started. The first thing is following recipes to a T without actually paying attention to my dough and my circumstances. In sourdough recipes, you'll often see written down, let the dough bulk ferment for 8 to 12 hours. And 4 hours is a lot. So until you really learn to pay attention to your dough and how it behaves, you probably won't really manage to pinpoint the exact right time to end bulk fermentation. And that's okay. And even when you learn to do that, your bread will probably turn out a bit different than the bread on the picture. And that's mainly because sourdough means fermenting your flour, and fermentation is, at least to some degree, an unpredictable process. So the person that wrote the recipe maybe even told you what kind of flour they used, even what kind of brand of flour they used. But even if you try to do exactly as they did, maybe their kitchen was a few degrees hotter than yours, maybe they live at a different elevation, maybe humidity was really high when they baked that bread. So those are all the factors that will contribute to your bread looking slightly different. And as long as it tastes good and as long as you like it, no reason to feel bad about it. So don't let the fact that your results won't be picture perfect at first discourage you, because you will get there. Slowly you will get there. The second mistake, or it was actually unrealistic expectation again, was expecting the dough to double in size every time I baked. I talk about this a lot on that channel, but every dough is a different story. So even a dough for sourdough bread can have different ratios of flour and water, and that will contribute to the dough fermenting slower or faster, and it will also contribute to how much this dough is actually able to rise, especially if you have enriched doughs you're dealing with, so some kind of brioche dough, or if you're making cinnamon rolls, something like that. When you have butter and milk and eggs in the dough, it probably won't rise as much. Now, I started noticing that some recipe developers are already taking note of that, and they will write in the recipe, that at least that's what I do, they will write, let the dough bulk ferment and expect it to rise in volume for about 50 to 70%. And that's really helpful because not every dough will double in volume. I remember at the beginning, I was waiting for my dough to double in volume every time, and I over-fermented a few doughs that way, and I under-fermented a few doughs that way. So just pay attention to your dough, and with time you will learn to see when the dough is fully fermented. And that doesn't necessarily mean it will double in size, or maybe some doughs will triple in size. The rise in volume is just one of the factors to look for when you are determining if your dough is finished with the bulk fermentation or not. I actually have a separate video all about that. I'll link it in the description down below, so be sure to check it out if that's the issue you're dealing with most often. So the third mistake I made was chasing the perfect open crumb. And when you go on the internet, it has you believe that the most perfect sourdough bread out there is the one that has those big holes in it. So that means there's a lot of bubbles in the dough before it bakes. And that's not necessarily good. I mean, the crumb of sourdough bread is subjective. So I was baking in the beginning and I was very proud of myself to achieve that kind of open crumb. But then I slathered some butter on there and I noticed that all the butter was disappearing in those large holes, and I didn't really like that. So I actually switched to baking sourdough with a tighter crumb because I found that that just works better for me and my family. I will tolerate some holes when I'm dipping the bread in stew or in soup or something like that, but just if I'm using it for sandwiches or just spreading something on it, which is, I most often use it that way, I don't really like those big holes. So Again, maybe let go of the expectation and start baking bread that actually suits your needs and your family's needs. That might not be the bread with bigger holes, it might be the bread with smaller holes. Mistake number 4 was to wait for the dough to form a bowl in a stand mixer. Now, some recipes require you to mix the dough in a stand mixer, and they will usually say mix for about 10 or 15 minutes. And then when the dough starts forming a bowl and stops sticking to the sides of the bowl, that means the dough is mixed. And I don't know about a KitchenAid mixer because I think that's what most people in the US have, but I have a Bosch mixer. And I know that except when I'm doing bagel dough, which is very dense, this one will form a bowl, but many other doughs won't, despite the instructions saying that it will. So if you're mixing for 15-20 minutes and you see that the dough is elastic and it maybe even passes the window pane test, so that means that if you stretch it you can almost see through it, like through a window, that means your dough is probably fully mixed. You don't need to wait for it to form a ball. So although those kind of instructions are helpful in some ways, they really aren't in others. So I just learned to, again, see the dough, feel the dough, and sometimes just decide for myself if it's finished mixing or not, even if it doesn't form a ball. Mistake number 5 is not realizing how much the brand of flour you're using when you bake matters. So I live in Europe, and a lot of brands of flours that are used in the US are not available here. And since most of the sourdough recipes that at least I was stumbling onto were written by American authors, I noticed that sometimes I really needed to add or reduce the amount of flour I was using. And I noticed that even people using the same type and the same brand of flour that the author used actually ended up with different results. So this again ties to mistake number 1. Don't follow a recipe to a T. If you see that your dough is a soupy mess, simply add more flour, even if the recipe doesn't require you to. Or if you see that the dough is really dry, add more water. And with time, again, everything will be better with time and with practice. You will get the feel of what kind of dough you are looking for when you're baking just plain loaf or brioche, or you'll learn many different doughs. But at the beginning, don't be afraid to just go by your feeling sometimes, not the recipe. Mistake number 6 is doing all the steps of the traditional sourdough process for every dough that I made, which again, I found that that doesn't really make sense and it isn't necessary. So for example, if you're baking a really high hydration sourdough loaf, that means you are using quite a lot of water in relation to flour. That dough will be sticky, it will be kind of hard to manage, it will become manageable, but it will still be sticky and kind of hard to shape. So with that kind of dough, you will really benefit if at the end of the bulk fermentation, you will pre-shape it. So that means you will get it into a neat ball and then you will leave it to rest and then you will do the final shaping. So you will stretch it a bit, do a few folds and then form it into a ball again. And that step, the step of pre-shaping, is necessary for that kind of dough. But if you're baking sourdough brioche or just a plain sourdough loaf that has a little more flour in it, so it's a lower hydration loaf, you don't really need to pre-shape the dough. It doesn't hurt, I think, but I rarely do it now, because if you see that the dough is manageable, it's elastic, it's something that you can easily work with, there's no reason to pre-shape it. And that's true for many steps in the process. So maybe at the beginning, learn the process and see what the steps are intended for, what they achieve, and then you will slowly start figuring out which steps are redundant for the particular dough that you are baking. Mistake number 7 is trying too many new things at once. So, like I said at the beginning, sourdough is a learning curve, and that means you will mess up all the time in the beginning. And if you want to build up to a great result, you will have to figure out which thing went wrong. And when you're figuring that out, I really encourage you to go slow, even if it takes you longer, but just go slow and test one thing at a time. So if the result isn't what you expected or what you desired, don't change the flour and then also change the ratio of water and flour, and then also change the baking temperature and the fermentation time, because even if the result will be perfect when you make all those changes, you will have no idea which change actually contributed to the result being better. So I really encourage you to go slow and do one tweak at a time, and through those tweaks you will see that your loaves will just get better and better, and you will actually know which things made the loaves better. Mistake number 8 is doing stretch and folds by the clock and not by the dough, and doing a certain amount of stretches and folds instead of paying attention to your dough. So again, we're at the point of going by the dough, not by some instructions out there that tell you what to do and they don't really know what your dough is like. So the purpose of stretch and folds is to, one, mix the ingredients a little bit better than the initial mixing, and two, to distribute the starter. And they also help to make the dough the same temperature. So when the dough starts to maybe cool a bit on the sides, when you do stretch and folds, you make it an even temperature again. And finally, the most important thing that stretch and folds do is to develop the gluten. So if we want the dough to become elastic and something that we can actually shape and bake, and it will bake into something beautiful, we need to develop the gluten. And gluten development, again, depends on your dough. Depends on how much flour, how much water you used, what's the temperature of your kitchen, what's the elevation, humidity, all those factors that I already talked about. And those factors will vary. So some doughs will stretch really far, and you will be able to do like 5 or 6 stretches before the gluten starts resisting. So you will see that the first and the second stretch you do, the dough will be really stretchy, and then it will start to tighten. And when it starts to tighten, that's your cue to stop stretching and folding and wait half an hour, or you will see actually when the dough starts to spread out a little. When the dough starts to lose its shape, it's time to another round of stretch and folds. And again, start doing them and you will see when the dough resists. So when the dough resists, it's time to stop with stretch and folds. That means even if you only get 3 stretches in before dough starts resisting, it's okay to do only 3. And then it's okay to wait for an hour if you see that the dough really holds shape well for that hour. There's no need to torture it with more stretch and folds after 15 minutes if you see that the gluten is still resisting. So that was a bit long-winded, but my point was that really go by the dough. If you can stretch it easily, stretch it until you can't anymore, leave it for a while, and then go back to it and repeat and repeat. Mistake number 9 is skipping hydration time when making doughs in a stand mixer. So as you might have noticed, when you are doing the mixing by hand, almost all the recipes have you leave the dough alone for 30 minutes so that the flour can absorb the water, and then you go handle it and stretch it or whatever you do. But when it comes to recipes that have you mix the dough in a stand mixer, the instructions are usually put all the ingredients into the bowl, turn the stand mixer on, and then knead it for that many minutes. And although that works great for some doughs, again, bagel dough comes to mind because it's really dense, and I think there's no need for a lot of gluten development there, because for the bagels we actually want them to be denser and chewier. But for other kinds of bread, I find that it's actually beneficial if I put all the ingredients into the bowl, mix just a little, maybe 2 or 3 minutes, just so the ingredients can connect. And then I turn off the stand mixer and give the flour to absorb all the water. So that takes about 20 to 30 minutes. And then when I turn it on again, I feel like the dough mixes so much easier, and I don't have to mix it for as long because it will get stretchy and elastic and manageable in a shorter amount of time because the flour is hydrated. So even if the recipe doesn't state that it's beneficial to leave the dough to rest after the initial mix, if you have a hard time mixing the dough, just doing it all at once after mixing the ingredients, really try to make that pause for the flour to absorb the water, turn the mixer back on again, and see how it goes. I bet it will make mixing easier for you. Mistake number 10 is flouring your work surface too much. At first, I was very afraid of the dough sticking to my surface. I thought that was the end. I thought my bread was going to be really bad if I got a sticky dough. But over time, I learned that there is such a thing as too much flour. Because if you put a lot of flour on the surface, you won't be able to create what is called surface tension. So when you are shaping the dough, this is after the bulk fermentation, when you're shaping the dough, you are first folding it kind of onto itself, and then you are forming a bowl, and you are sliding the bowl towards yourself to create the tension on the surface of the dough. And that is what will give you a nice oven rise, and it will also make the bread rise better on the second rise. But to achieve that surface tension, you have to have some resistance on your work surface. So the dough almost has to stick just a little, so you are able to create the tension. And if you have too much flour everywhere, it will just slide on the flour. You won't be able to do a nice ball of dough. So that's something to keep in mind. By all means, flour the surface if the dough is sticky, but if it's not overly sticky, maybe don't even flour the surface. I feel like a lot of the baking I do now, I don't even flour the surface and I can shape the doughs just fine. Mistake number 11 is baking too early. So especially if you're making enriched doughs like croissants, crescent rolls, even dinner rolls and cinnamon rolls, all the rolls, they're all made from enriched dough. And enriched dough really benefits from a long second rise. I don't think I ever fermented enriched doughs. There's something about them that it's hard to over ferment, but it is easy to under ferment. So when you are shaping the dough and the instructions in the recipe say leave it for 2 hours and then bake it, I would suggest waiting a bit longer. That, of course, depends heavily on the recipe, but in my experience, things with enriched doughs, sourdough brioche is the perfect example for that, I usually leave them to do the second rise for 6 to 8 hours even, because you will notice it just gets puffier and puffier and puffier, and if you cut the second rise at 2 hours, you are missing out on all the puffiness that would develop if you would leave it for 6 hours. So that's it really, just go by the recipe, and if you feel like the dough would get even a bit puffier if you would leave it longer, try to leave it longer next time. Because like I said, enriched doughs are hard to over ferment. Mistake number 12 is being scared of low hydration dough. So most of the people are scared of higher hydration doughs. So that means the doughs that have more water in them, and that makes them a bit more sticky, a bit harder to shape, harder to bulk ferment even, because the signs are sometimes just not there if the dough is really hydrated. But I was actually scared of lowering the hydration because I thought that my bread will somehow be lesser or not as good if I lower the hydration. Because my logic was, if it is easier to make, it's got to be worse. Because why would people deal with such high hydration doughs if they weren't just better? And that's not true in my experience. Both high and low hydration doughs have some pluses and minuses, but again, it's all subjective. So if you think that the tighter crumb will suit you better, I would encourage you to lower the hydration of your dough. So use a bit less water and you will have dough that will be easier to manage and you'll like it better. So just everything is subjective. Don't be afraid of lower hydration dough. Mistake number 13 is something that I talk a lot about on this channel, and it's thinking that you need a special recipe for each thing that you bake. For example, you need a special recipe for brioche loaf, and then for cinnamon rolls, and then for dinner rolls, when in reality, all those things that I just listed can be made from a simple brioche dough. So not only it's way less complicated to just memorize one dough and perfect one dough and make many things from it, it can give you even better results, I think, because some recipes are just better than others. And if you find a recipe that you really like and you perfect it, don't think that you have to use it just for that thing. If you really love the way that your cinnamon rolls turn out, I encourage you to use that recipe and make dinner rolls. Maybe skip a bit of sugar if you don't want them so sweet, but otherwise don't be afraid to experiment. We have a lot of recipes out there nowadays, but you don't really need a special recipe for everything you bake. You can actually have like 3 or 4 core recipes, like one that's more brioche-like, one that's for plain loaves, one that's for salty things, and you can make a lot of things with just those doughs. Mistake number 14 is not using fridge nearly enough. Fridge is something that comes in handy when you're baking with sourdough because it kind of pauses things. So if you run out of time and you don't have time to finish a certain recipe, just throw everything into the fridge and you can come back to it the next day or even after 2 days. And I actually like to do the second rise in the fridge because I think it makes the dough easier to score. I think the oven rise is better. So I really encourage you to think about the ways that you can use your fridge because it can make things easier and better. And mistake number 15 is thinking that fridge will pause things instantly. And that's a common misconception. I think people think that when they throw the dough into the fridge, the fermentation just stops right away. And that's not true. The fermentation, it will almost come to a halt when the dough comes to the temperature of the fridge. So if you move the dough from room temperature into the fridge, it will probably take about at least an hour or 2 for the dough to reach the fridge temperature and slow down the fermentation. So if you know in advance that you will be putting something into the fridge, I encourage you to put it into the fridge maybe an hour or 2 before you would normally cut the fermentation short. So that way the dough has a chance to come to temperature and you will get a similar result as if you wouldn't use the fridge. So for example, if you are used to bulk fermenting the dough for 8 hours and then you shape it and you do a final rise at room temperature for 2 hours and then bake it, and you want to kind of make that recipe suitable for being a 2-day process and you want to do a overnight cold ferment instead of the second rise, I suggest to let the dough bulk ferment for 6 to 7 hours, so not going for 8 hours but for a bit less, and then put it into the fridge, and that way the dough will still ferment and it will slow down just in time for the recipe to give you a similar result than if you would not use the fridge. So I really hope those tips were helpful. Please, if you have any questions, leave them in the comments down below. I will try to get back to all of you, and I'm also thinking about doing a kind of Q&A type of video in the future if I get a lot of questions, because like I said at the beginning, sourdough is a learning curve and I think it's so much more manageable and so much more fun if we are able to learn together and share the things we learn. So if you have a helpful tip for beginners, write that in the comments as well, and I hope to see you in the next video next Friday. Bye!